Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jason Godin. Today I'll be speaking about a matter that really affects my heart. It's the land ownership rights of the Aboriginals and the historical amnesia that the government, the Canadian government in fact, has put towards them in history books. There is no mention of their suffering or loss of ancestry and land. This is a huge problem, and as this TED Talk goes along, I will explain. Since the dawn of time, history has been written by only a selected few amongst an entire population. Usually, those who write history are the dominant group with the power through political, economic, or military dominance. Thus, what is taught to society as history is not always accurate. It is merely an account of how the winners won, from the winner's self-glorifying perspective. This may involve cultural or historical amnesia, where an entire period of time or event is suppressed and ignored in order to make the dominant group seem more righteous. For example, the Parliament of Canada in 1876 activated the Indian Act, which prohibited registered Indians to their bands and system of Indian reserves. The Canadian government was trying to assimilate the natives Indians to become more like the white man's culture and less like the old traditional Indian. This act of assimilation was done for one reason, and it was for land ownership rights. One sec, a little dry parched. The Canadian government in the late 19th and 20th century thought that if they could split up the Indian reserves and break up the culture, that the Indians would not have rights or claims to any of the land ownerships, and the Canadian government could just take it without any struggle. These Canadians created residential schools, which were the strategies to help prevent further native cultures from blossoming. They would take these children from their reserves and teach them about Christianity, white Canadian culture. They would not allow them to speak their own native language. Any whom speak their native tongue would be punished severely. These schools did a very good job at assimilating Aboriginals to such an extent that many of the children never saw their families again. It would take years before they could even meet their family members, and when they did meet them, they had no way of relating or communicating because these residential schools distorted them from their ancestry. Such examples of these land ownership rights would be James Bay. On November 15, 1973, the Cree and the Inuits won a major court victory when Mr. Justice Albert Malouf of the Quebec Superior Court granted injunction to stop the construction of the James Bay project. The injunction is overturned a week later, but it paves the way for the first modern-day land claim settlements in Canada. In November 11, 1975, the Cree Inuit give their claim to certain land in northern Quebec in return for $225 million in compensation. That's amazing that the Canadian government decided to do that. But you have other situations such as Oka crisis was a land dispute between groups of Mohawk people and the town of Oka, Quebec, Canada, which began July 11, 1990 and lasted until September 26, 1990. And Marcel Lemay was killed by a bullet whose sources have never officially determined. This dispute was the first well-publicized violent conflict between the First Nations and the Canadian government in the late 20th century. The crisis developed from a local dispute between the town of Oka and the Mohawk community. The town of Oka was developing plans to expand the golf course and residential development onto land which had traditionally been used by the Mohawks. It included pine land and burial grounds marked by the standing tombstones of their ancestors. The Mohawks had filled a land claim for the allegedly sacred groves and burial grounds near Kansataki, but their claim had been rejected in 1986 on technical grounds. A lot of more stories like that. It's very sad. A lot of these schools, which these children were put into, these residential schools, were poorly irrigated and had difficulty providing for the natives with their funding and their careless system of governing. The government wanted them to perish or fade away into the system. These residential schools were a cesspool for diseases and illnesses. One common disease was tuberculosis, which caused more than 50% of native students to have tuberculosis. With a range of 30 to 60% mortality rate in the schools, not only were these schools disease-filled, but the students were cramped into small sleeping quarters. Not enough food to even feed half the population in the school. The government knew what was going on, and they knew that these schools were cesspools of bacteria, and these children were just malnourished and sleeping in tight, cramped area together, where they would just, of course, get all sick. And the fact that they separated them and segregated them from their parents, it allowed the Canadian government to completely, historically, fade a generation that would let the Canadian government keep their land rights. It's very sad. The Canadian government still decided to ignore these reports and follow along with the Indian Act that was set upon the Native population. Not only did these schools affect the present day of the Native population, but it also created a visible scar in the future generations for Native populations. This cause of residential schools and were so huge, and it created Native Americans to live unhealthy lifestyle choices, and in the near future, psychologically affecting their minds. These residential schools, students who grew up in these schools, later never really connected with their families and sought to be unfit parents as well in the future. And they would get their children taken away from them because they were in drug abuse and gambling and all sorts of things because of the effects of the residential schools. So not only did it affect one generation, but multiple Native generations. All these residential schools and historical amnesia was to further distance the Canadian government from the land ownership rights with the Aboriginals. They completely made a culture and people disappear to the extent of disconnecting Aboriginal children from their families and ancestry to become like the white Canadian and hopefully forget about their heritage and land rights that the Canadian government snatched. I'd like to thank everybody here tonight for listening to this important historical page in the history books of Canada that have been disappeared from secondary schools, elementary schools, pretty much everywhere. This is an important fact. This is something that everybody needs to know, and it's just so darn shameful that Canada has actually went in this direction. And the way to change this is to spread the truth and information, and Canada and the Natives can heal together and build towards a future. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.